The text arrived at 6:47 p.m., 3 minutes before I was supposed to sit down for what I thought would be a peaceful dinner with my daughter. Call me now. My lawyer's words glowed on my phone screen like a warning flare. When I heard what she had to say, my hands went numb around the device. 23 years of sacrifice, of putting my daughter's needs before my own, of every dollar I'd scraped together going toward her future, all of it had been orchestrated lies. But as I hung up and walked toward that dining room, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. They had no idea what was coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. The dining room looked exactly as it always did when Elena visited. My mother's china carefully arranged, fresh flowers from the garden she used to play in as a child, the roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing cooling on the carved wooden table I'd inherited from my father. Everything perfect, everything welcoming, just as I'd done every Sunday for the past 5 years since her divorce. I smoothed the tablecloth with trembling fingers, my lawyer's voice still echoing in my ears. She's been planning this for months, Jennifer had said. The power of attorney documents, the property transfers, everything has your daughter's signature authorizing it. She's been working with someone else, someone who knows exactly how to manipulate the system. Elena's laughter drifted from the living room where she was supposedly catching up with her husband, David. I'd grown to appreciate David over the years. Steady, hardworking, nothing like the wastrel she'd married the first time. But now I wondered what conversations had been happening in my absence, what plans had been whispered over the very meals I'd lovingly prepared. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Jennifer. The bank statements show withdrawals dating back 8 months. They've been systematic. 8 months. I pressed my palm against the mahogany sideboard, feeling the familiar grain beneath my fingers. 8 months ago was when Alina had insisted I needed help managing my finances, when she'd convinced me that at 72, I shouldn't be handling everything alone. You're not getting any younger, Dad, she'd said with that concerned smile I'd trusted implicitly. Let me take some of the burden off your shoulders. The burden, my life's work, the investments I'd carefully tended, the rental properties I'd acquired one by one through decades of careful saving, all of it had become a burden in her eyes. Or perhaps, I was beginning to realize, an opportunity. Dad? Elena appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the warm light from the chandelier. She looked so much like her mother had at that age, and for a moment, I felt that familiar surge of paternal pride. Then I remembered Jennifer's words. They've already moved $40,000 from your savings account. Coming, sweetheart, I managed, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. Just making sure everything's ready. She smiled. That same bright smile she'd given me when she was 7 and had broken my favorite watch, when she was 16 and had crashed my car, when she was 25 and had needed money for her first house down payment. Always so confident that forgiveness would come, that love would cover the damage. As I followed her toward the living room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at me had the same graying hair, the same tired eyes, but something fundamental had shifted. The phone call had cracked something open, and what was emerging felt entirely different from the accommodating father who'd walked into this house an hour ago. The living room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with an undercurrent I'd never noticed before. David sat in my favorite armchair, the leather recliner I'd bought myself for my 60th birthday, scrolling through his phone with the casual entitlement of someone who'd grown comfortable in another man's space. He glanced up as we entered, offering that practiced smile that had once seemed genuine. "Ray, great to see you," he said, rising just enough to be polite but not enough to actually vacate my chair. The gesture struck me differently now, like watching a performance I'd been unconsciously funding for years. David. I settled onto the couch, the same spot I'd occupied every Sunday while they claimed the prime seating. From here, I had a clear view of both their faces, could study the micro-expressions I'd been too trusting to analyze before. "How's the new job going?" Something flickered across Elena's features, so brief I might have imagined it if I hadn't been looking for it. "Oh, you know Dad," same old corporate grind, but David's been handling some side consulting work. Haven't you, honey? David's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his phone. Just some financial planning for friends, nothing major. Financial planning. I felt that cold calculation from the hallway settle deeper into my chest, like ice forming in still water. That's interesting. I didn't know you had experience in that area. Well, I've picked up a few things over the years, he said with a modest shrug that felt rehearsed, especially dealing with older clients who need help organizing their affairs. Older clients. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a gun I was just beginning to see. I let the silence stretch, watching as David's casual confidence began to show hairline cracks. Elena filled the void with nervous chatter about her work, but I barely heard her words. Instead, I was remembering the documents Jennifer had described. Power of attorney forms with David's business address listed as the contact, bank account changes that had required notarized signatures I couldn't remember giving. You know, I said, cutting through Elena's monologue about office politics, I had the strangest conversation with my lawyer today. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elena's laugh came a beat too late. Oh, nothing serious, I hope. She mentioned some unusual activity on my accounts, transfers I don't recall authorizing. I kept my voice conversational, almost curious, as if discussing the weather. But I was watching David now, noting how his thumb had stopped scrolling, how his shoulders had gone rigid. Apparently, there's been quite a bit of movement over the past 8 months. Dad, you know how these banks are, Elena said quickly. They're always sending those notifications about routine transfers and account maintenance. Remember how confused you were about that investment rollover? Confused. The word landed like a slap, but I absorbed it without flinching. How many times had they used that word to describe me lately? How many instances of my supposed confusion had they cited to justify taking control? The thing is, I continued, my voice still maddeningly calm, Jennifer seemed to think these weren't routine at all. She seemed to think someone had been quite systematic about it, professional even. David finally spoke, and his voice carried a tremor that satisfied something cold and patient inside me. Richard, maybe we should sit down and go through everything together. Sometimes these financial firms make errors. Oh, we will. The promise in my voice was soft as silk and sharp as winter. We absolutely will sit down and go through everything. Jennifer is preparing a complete audit trail. Every transaction, every signature, every document filed. I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face, but strangely comfortable. She mentioned something about forensic accounting. Fascinating process, apparently. The color had drained from Elena's face. Dad, I think you might be overreacting. Am I? I leaned back against the couch cushions, and I'm finally at ease in my own home for the first time in months. Because Jennifer also mentioned that attempted financial exploitation of elderly family members carries serious criminal penalties in this state. Something about vulnerability statutes making it a felony. The silence that followed was delicious. I could almost hear the wheels turning in their minds. The frantic recalculation of risks and benefits. David's phone had gone dark in his hands. Forgotten. Elena's mouth opened and closed like she was drowning in air that had suddenly become too thin to breathe. I think, I said, rising slowly from my seat, dinner can wait a few more minutes. Why don't we all sit down at that dining room table, and you can help me understand exactly what kind of help you've been providing with my finances. As I walked toward the dining room, I felt their eyes boring into my back, felt the shift in the house's atmosphere like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. The accommodating father was gone, dissolved like sugar in the acid of betrayal. What remained was something harder, something that had been forged in the crucible of broken trust and sharpened by the knowledge that love, apparently, had limits. But strategy? Strategy was limitless. The dining room had transformed into something resembling a courtroom, the warm familial atmosphere evaporating like steam from cooling coffee. Elena and David sat across from me at the mahogany table that had once hosted birthday celebrations and holiday feasts, their faces pale in the chandelier's unforgiving light. The roast sat between us, forgotten, growing cold like the affection I'd once felt so certain of. Dad, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, Elena began, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard her use with difficult clients at her marketing firm. You've been so stressed lately, and I know managing everything can be overwhelming. Overwhelming. I repeated the word slowly, tasting its implications. Is that what we're calling it now? David leaned forward, assuming the role of reasonable mediator. Ray, what Elena means is that we've only been trying to help. You signed those papers yourself, remember? You said you wanted us to handle the day-to-day financial stuff so you could focus on enjoying your retirement. The memory they referenced was real, but filtered through their retelling, it became something distorted, convenient. I could see them now as if through clear water instead of the muddy emotions that had clouded my judgment for months. The concerned expressions, the gentle insistence that I was forgetting things, the subtle suggestions that managing my own affairs was becoming too much for me. I remember signing papers, I said carefully, but I don't remember authorizing the liquidation of my municipal bond portfolio or the transfer of the rental property deeds to a trust I've never heard of. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Those were smart financial moves, Dad. David researched everything thoroughly. That trust protects your assets from potential medical expenses down the road. Medical expenses I don't have for conditions I don't possess. I felt something sharp and clean cutting through the fog of doubt they'd been weaving around me for months. And the $40,000 that's gone missing from my checking account, was that protecting me too? Missing is a strong word, David interjected, his consultant's polish beginning to crack. Those funds were moved to a higher yield savings account. I can show you the paperwork. I'm sure you can, just like you can show me the power of attorney documents that somehow give you authority over accounts you're not even listed on. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my phone, placing it deliberately on the table between us. Jennifer is very thorough. She's already contacted the bank, the investment firm, and the county recorder's office. The silence that followed was thick with recalculation. I could almost hear the whispered conversations that must have taken place in my absence, the careful planning that had gone into this systematic stripping away of everything I'd built. But now they were improvising, and improvisation revealed character in ways that careful preparation never could. You're acting paranoid, Dad, Elena said, and there it was, the word I'd been waiting for. This behavior isn't like you. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Morrison, have him run some tests. Ah, the sound escaped me like a laugh that had gone cold. There it is, the dementia card. How long have you two been building that narrative? David's face had gone ashen. No one's talking about dementia, Ray. We're talking about normal age-related changes in judgment. Changes that conveniently require you to take control of my assets? I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 72 years in my bones, but also feeling something else, a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. Tell me, David, what's your cut? 10%? 20%? Or did Elena promise you something more substantial for playing the concerned son-in-law? Dad, stop. Elena's voice cracked like ice under pressure. You're talking about your own daughter, about your family. Family, the word that had been my weakness, my blind spot, the lever they'd used to move everything I'd built. But now it sounded different in the air between us, hollow and manipulative. My family wouldn't steal from me, I said quietly. My family wouldn't gaslight me into thinking I was losing my mind to justify robbing me blind. The masks were slipping now, and what lay beneath was uglier than I'd allowed myself to imagine. Elena's composure finally cracked, and when it did, the sound was like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Her perfect mask, the one that had fooled me for so many months, slipped away to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white against the dark wood. Fine. You want to know the truth, Dad? Her voice pitched higher, taking on a shrill quality I'd never heard before. The chandelier light caught the tears forming in her eyes, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fury, of a cornered animal realizing the trap was closing. The truth is that you've been making terrible financial decisions for years. That investment in your brother's restaurant? Completely worthless. $30,000 down the drain because you couldn't say no to family. Each word hit me like a physical blow, but what struck deeper was the contempt in her voice. Pure, undiluted disdain for the generosity she'd once claimed to admire. I felt my chest tighten. Not from any medical condition, but from the realization that my daughter saw my compassion as weakness, my love as stupidity. The money you lent to the Hendersons when they were facing foreclosure, she continued, her voice gaining momentum like a runaway train. They haven't made a payment in 6 months, and you just smile and nod like some senile old fool whenever they make excuses. They're good for it, you say. They just need time. Someone had to step in before you gave away everything you'd worked for to every sob story that knocked on your door. The words senile old fool hung in the air like a slap across my face. I could feel something fracturing inside me, not breaking, but transforming, like coal under pressure becoming diamond. When I spoke, my voice was quieter than before, but it carried a weight that made both of them flinch. So you decided to steal it instead. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Elena's face went through a spectrum of emotions, shock, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief, as if she were glad the pretense was finally over. We didn't steal anything. David's voice exploded across the room, his careful consultant's facade crumbling like a house of cards. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, veins bulging at his temples as he leaned forward in his chair. The transformation was startling. The mild-mannered son-in-law I'd grown to trust was gone, replaced by something predatory and desperate. We invested it properly. We protected it from your bleeding heart and your terrible judgment. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, his hands gesturing wildly. Do you have any idea what your portfolio looked like before I restructured it? Your so-called financial advisor, that incompetent fool Peterson, had you in municipal bonds yielding 2% while inflation was eating away at your principal like termites in wood. The trust we established will save you thousands in estate taxes when you die. The casual way he said, when you die, sent ice water through my veins. Not if, when. As though my death was not a natural inevitability, but a scheduled event on their calendar. Estate taxes, I repeated, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The quiet seemed to amplify rather than diminish the menace in my tone. How remarkably thoughtful of you to plan for my death so meticulously. Tell me, what's the timeline on that particular event? When exactly were you expecting me to need this protection? The question hung in the room like a noose, swaying gently in the silence. I watched Elena's face cycle through a range of micro-expressions: fear, calculation, defiance, while David's mouth opened and closed like a beached fish gasping for air. Elena's face flushed crimson, the color spreading down her neck like spilled wine. God, listen to yourself. Do you hear how paranoid you sound? But even as she tried to project indignation, I could see the panic in her eyes. The way her pupils had dilated, the fine tremor in her voice that spoke of barely controlled terror. We're trying to preserve your legacy, and you're acting like we're plotting your murder. The words hung between us like a challenge, daring me to voice the unthinkable. So I did. Are you? The question came out softer than I'd intended, but it detonated in the room like a bomb. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing against my lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft whistle of wind through the weather stripping. Sounds that had been masked by conversation now stood out in sharp relief against the crushing silence. Because according to Jennifer, I continued, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest, someone's been paying premiums on a life insurance policy I don't remember signing for. $500,000, with you two as the sole beneficiaries. David's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The blood drained from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His carefully styled hair seemed to deflate, and his shoulders sagged as though an invisible weight had settled on them. His hands began to shake. Not a subtle tremor, but a full, visible quaking that he couldn't hide no matter how he tried to still them against the table. Elena's reaction was even more telling. Her mouth fell open in a perfect O of shock, and she made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a cry, that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. For a moment, she looked exactly like she had at 7 years old, and I'd caught her with chocolate smeared across her face, standing next to the empty candy dish, the same wide-eyed expression of someone caught in an undeniable lie. The truth was a living thing in the room now, filling every corner, making the air thick and hard to breathe. I could smell it, the acrid scent of fear sweat, the metallic tang of adrenaline, the sour odor of guilt finally exposed to daylight. That, that was just financial planning, David stammered, his voice cracking like an adolescent boy's. His carefully maintained professional demeanor had evaporated completely, leaving behind something small and desperate. Insurance is part of any comprehensive estate strategy. I was protecting Elena's future, making sure she'd be taken care of if something happened to you. If something happened to me, I repeated, savoring each syllable like fine wine. The phrase tasted different now, loaded with implications that chilled my blood. How remarkably considerate. And the increased dosage on my blood pressure medication that you suggested I discuss with Dr. Morrison? Was that part of the comprehensive strategy too? The color that had drained from David's face rushed back all at once, turning him brick red from his collar to his hairline. Elena shot to her feet so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a shriek that made us all flinch. The sound seemed to galvanize her, and when she spoke, her voice carried the desperate fury of a trapped animal. "That's enough!" She slammed her palm down on the table, making the water glasses jump and the silverware jangle like wind chimes. "I won't sit here and listen to you accuse us of whatever sick, twisted thing you're implying." Her chest heaved with each breath, and I could see the pulse hammering in her throat. "You're not well, Dad. This paranoid thinking, these horrible accusations, it's exactly what Dr. Morrison warned us might happen as you got older." "Dr. Morrison warned you?" I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with audible precision. "When exactly did you have this conversation with my doctor? Because I don't recall giving anyone permission to discuss my medical information." David's attempt at damage control came too late. Elena just meant in general terms, hypothetically. "No," Elena said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "I meant specifically. I called his office 3 weeks ago because I was worried about you, about the forgetfulness, the confusion, the way you've been repeating yourself. Dr. Morrison said these could be early signs of cognitive decline and that we should be prepared to make difficult decisions about your care." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I absorbed it without flinching. My own daughter, discussing my mental competency behind my back, laying the groundwork for a narrative that would justify everything they'd already done and everything they planned to do. "Prepared to make difficult decisions," I said, my voice deadly calm, like having me declared incompetent, like taking guardianship, like making me a prisoner in my own life while you liquidate everything I've built. "It's not like that," Elena started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "No more lies." The words came out with a finality that seemed to suck the air from the room. "I know about the nursing home consultations. Jennifer found the applications in David's business records. Willowbrook Gardens, wasn't it? The one with the memory care unit?" Elena collapsed back into her chair as if her strings had been cut. David stared at his hands, the fight gone out of him like air from a punctured tire. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 23 years of love twisted into something unrecognizable. But I wasn't finished. This was just the beginning of what they'd set in motion, and I intended to see it through to its conclusion. After all, they'd taught me that family loyalty was just another asset to be managed, and I'd learned the lesson well. The silence that followed my revelation about Willowbrook Gardens stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. I could see Elena and David exchanging glances. Quick, desperate communications that spoke of plans unraveling and alliances fracturing. The comfortable conspiracy they'd maintained for months was cracking under the weight of exposure. David was the first to break, his composure disintegrating like wet paper. "Elena, you said he didn't know about any of that," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear every accusatory syllable. "You said the applications were just preliminary research, that we'd never have to." "Shut up," Elena snapped, her mask of concerned daughter slipping completely away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Just shut up, David. You're making everything worse." The crack in their united front was exactly what I'd been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of watching a carefully constructed lie collapse under its own weight. Preliminary research, I repeated, savoring the words. How thorough of you. Tell me, David, what exactly did you think would happen to me once I was safely tucked away in memory care? How long were you planning to keep me there? David's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: panic, guilt, and something that looked almost like relief at finally being able to speak honestly. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Elena said we just needed time to reorganize your finances properly, to protect your assets from potential lawsuits or medical expenses. She said you'd understand eventually. I said we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. Elena's voice rose to a near shriek, and I saw something I'd never witnessed before: genuine fear. Not the calculated concern she'd performed for months, but raw, primal terror of consequences she'd never allowed herself to consider. The transformation was fascinating to watch. The daughter, who'd spent months treating me like a confused child, was now turning on her own husband with the fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were crumbling. I could see the precise moment when self-preservation overtook loyalty, when the conspiracy of two became every person for themselves. You came to me with this idea, David shot back, his voice gaining strength as his own desperation mounted. You're the one who said your father was becoming a burden, that he was making foolish financial decisions that would eat up your inheritance. You're the one who suggested the power of attorney, the trust, all of it. Each accusation hit Alina like a physical blow, and I watched her face go through a rapid succession of emotions: shock at his betrayal, rage at his weakness, and finally, a cold calculation that chilled my blood. That's not how I remember it, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. I remember you coming to me with a very detailed plan about asset protection and estate management. I remember you showing me projections about what my father's wealth could become with proper handling. I remember you being very, very persuasive about the benefits of taking a more active role in his affairs. The room had become a battlefield, and I was watching two people who'd been united in exploiting me now turn their weapons on each other. It was almost beautiful in its symmetry, the trust they'd violated being violated in return, the loyalty they'd betrayed now betraying them. But then Elena's phone buzzed, cutting through the tension like a knife. She glanced at the screen, and I watched her face go completely white. "What is it?" David demanded, but Alina was already standing, her hands shaking as she stared at the device. "It's my mother-in-law," she whispered, and for the first time all evening she sounded like the daughter I remembered, young, frightened, and completely out of her depth. "She says there are police officers at our house. They want to speak with David about financial fraud allegations." The bottom dropped out of David's world so completely that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He made a sound like a wounded animal, his face crumpling as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "Police?" he gasped. "Elena, you said your lawyer friend assured you that what we were doing was perfectly legal, that power of attorney gave us the authority." "Jennifer isn't my lawyer friend," I said quietly, and both of them turned to stare at me as if they'd forgotten I was there. "Jennifer Harrison is one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in the state. She also happens to be married to Detective Lieutenant Harrison of the Financial Crimes Unit." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the street outside, could hear the soft whistle of wind through the trees, but in the dining room, it was as if the world had stopped breathing. Elena sank back into her chair, her phone falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the hardwood floor. David stared at me with the expression of a man who just realized he'd been playing chess with a grandmaster while thinking it was checkers. "You knew," Elena whispered. "You knew all along." I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "No, sweetheart. I suspected for weeks, but I only knew for certain when Jennifer called me 3 hours ago. You see, she's been building a case against financial exploitation rings targeting elderly victims. When I brought her my concerns about some unusual account activity, she discovered something very interesting." I paused, letting the weight of revelation settle over them like a shroud. "David, You've been running this same scheme on 3 other families over the past 2 years. Did you really think no one would eventually connect the dots? The revelation about David's other victims hung in the air like a death sentence. I watched my daughter's face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally a desperate kind of calculation as she tried to find a way out of the trap that was closing around them. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She turned to David with wild eyes, searching his face for some sign that I was lying, that this was just another paranoid delusion from her supposedly declining father. "David, tell him that's not true. Tell him you've never." But David's silence was answer enough. His shoulders had sagged completely, and he sat staring at his hands like a man watching his own execution. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "The Weatherbys lost their farmland," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. 80 acres that had been in their family for 4 generations, and Mrs. Chen, she was so confused about why her savings account was empty when her son came to visit from Seattle. Elena recoiled as if he'd slapped her. "No. No, you told me this was different. You said my father was a special case, that we were helping him, protecting him from his own bad decisions." "I told you what you wanted to hear," David said, and there was something almost like relief in his confession. "Just like I told the others. The Weatherby's son thought his parents were making poor investment choices. Mrs. Chen's daughter was convinced her mother was developing dementia. It's always the same story, Elena. Families who think they know better, who are willing to believe their loved ones are incompetent if it means they can justify taking control." The words hit Alina like physical blows, and I watched 23 years of self-justification crumble before my eyes. This was the moment I'd been building toward, not just the exposure of their crimes, but the complete destruction of the narrative they'd used to convince themselves they were the heroes of this story. But my father really was making bad decisions," Elena said desperately, grasping for some thread of righteousness to hold on to. "The restaurant investment, the money he lent to friends, all of it." "Generosity isn't incompetence," I said quietly, and my voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the room like a physical force. "Compassion isn't dementia, and choosing to help people instead of hoarding wealth isn't a symptom of decline. It's a choice you decided I wasn't competent to make." Elena's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would cry when she accidentally stepped on a bug, who would give away her Halloween candy to kids who didn't have costumes. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by something harder and more desperate. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "David's business was struggling. We had the mortgage to think about, college funds for the kids we might have someday. You have more money than you could ever spend, just sitting there while we're trying to build a life. So you decided to build that life with my assets," I finished for her. "Without my knowledge, without my consent, while actively working to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could continue stealing without interference." The word stealing landed like a hammer blow. Elena flinched as if I'd struck her, and when she looked at me, there was something broken in her eyes, the look of someone whose self-image had been shattered beyond repair. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered. "It started so small, just helping you with some paperwork, making sure you weren't being taken advantage of by scammers or con artists. But then David showed me how much money you were losing to bad investments and loans that would never be repaid, and I thought maybe we could do better." "And when did helping become stealing?" I asked. "When did protecting become plotting? When did love become avarice?" Elena had no answer, and David seemed to have retreated so far into himself that he might as well have vanished entirely. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of broken trust and shattered relationships. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the message from Jennifer. "Officers are at their residence. David's other victims have been contacted. Full investigation underway. How are you holding up?" I looked up to find both of them watching me with the desperate hope of drowning people reaching for a life preserver. But I was no longer the accommodating father who would sacrifice everything to keep his family happy. That man had died somewhere between the lawyer's phone call and this moment of complete revelation. "The police will want to interview you both," I said, my voice steady and clinical. "Jennifer has advised me that cooperation might be looked upon favorably by the prosecutor, but that's your decision to make." "Dad," Elena said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Please, we're family. Surely we can work something out, some way to make this right without involving the courts." Family. I let the word hang in the air, tasting its bitter flavor. "You're right, Elena. We are family. And that makes what you've done to me infinitely worse than if you'd been strangers. Strangers I might have forgiven eventually. But you knew exactly how much your betrayal would hurt, and you did it anyway." I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 72 years in my bones, but also feeling something else, a clarity and purpose I hadn't experienced in months. The accommodating father was gone, dissolved in the acid of their betrayal. What remained was something harder, something that had been forged in the crucible of broken trust and tempered by the knowledge that love, apparently, had been nothing more than a tool in their hands. "The house keys," I said quietly. "Both sets. Now." They stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, unable to comprehend that the man they'd been manipulating for months was no longer available for exploitation. "This is my house, purchased with money I earned over decades of work. You are no longer welcome here." The weeks that followed moved with the inexorable momentum of justice finally unleashed. I sat in my study each morning, reading updates from Jennifer about the investigation's progress, watching the careful architecture of David's schemes crumble under professional scrutiny. The same methodical attention to detail he'd used to exploit his victims now worked against him as forensic accountants traced every fraudulent transaction back to its source. Elena called 17 times in the first week. I answered once. "Dad, please." Her voice was hoarse with tears and desperation. "We need to talk. There has to be some way to fix this, some way to make things right between us." "There was," I said quietly. "It was called honesty. It was called respect. It was called treating me like your father instead of your mark." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. Then, "I know I made mistakes, but we're family. Family forgives. Family finds a way." "Family doesn't steal from family," I interrupted, my voice carrying a finality that seemed to reach through the phone and settle over her like a shroud. "Family doesn't conspire to have loved ones declared incompetent for financial gain. Family doesn't shop for nursing homes behind each other's backs." I heard her breath catch, a sound like something breaking. "Dad, you made your choice, Elena. Every signature you forged, every lie you told, every meeting you had with David about my assets, those were all choices. Now you get to live with the consequences." I hung up and blocked her number. The silence that followed was the most peaceful I'd experienced in months. David's sentencing hearing was brief. 18 months in prison, full restitution to all victims, and a permanent ban from working in any financial advisory capacity. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back once at Elena, who sat weeping in the gallery. The look they shared contained multitudes: blame, regret, and the bitter recognition that they destroyed not just their victims' trust, but each other's as well. Elena received probation and community service. Her cooperation with the investigation had earned her leniency with Strand. I wasn't certain she deserved, but justice had been served nonetheless. The Weatherbys got their farm back. Mrs. Chen's savings were restored with interest. The other victims found closure, if not complete healing. That evening, I walked through my house, truly my house again, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the fragile peace of ignorance, but the solid peace that comes from standing on firm ground after weathering a storm. Jennifer stopped by with a bottle of wine and the final paperwork. "All your assets have been restored," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "plus penalties and interest. You're actually wealthier now than before they started their scheme." I smiled at the irony. "Blood money. Justice money," she corrected. "There's a difference." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood that some victories come at a price that makes celebration impossible. "Any regrets?" she asked finally. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the destruction of my relationship with Elena? The quiet house that would never again echo with family dinners and holiday celebrations? The grandchildren I'd never meet? None, I said, and meant it completely. She taught me something valuable, that love without respect is just another form of control, that trust must be earned continuously, even from family. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's transformation into a person they'll eventually despise. The moral of this story isn't complicated. When people show you who they really are, believe them. When family treats you like a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved, set boundaries that protect your dignity. And remember that the capacity for strategy lives within every person who's been pushed too far by those who mistake kindness for weakness. As I sat there in my study, surrounded by the documents that prove justice could still be served, I realized something profound. The accommodating father they'd manipulated for months hadn't been destroyed by their betrayal. He'd been revealed as an illusion. The real me, the strategist who'd built a life of careful investments and thoughtful decisions, had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Elena had been right about one thing. I had taught her about integrity. The tragedy was that she'd learned to see it as a weakness to be exploited rather than a strength to be emulated. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't empty. It was full of self-respect, dignity, and the hard-won knowledge that some prices are too high to pay, even for family, especially for family. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. And as always, thank you for watching.